Now let's have a look at what's been happening in today's papers. And joining me now is John Sargent, the former BBC and ITN political correspondent. John, morning.
Good morning.
It's a difficult day for the papers because the news is so...
Set me summarise what's in all the papers about this incredibly important story. You can't underestimate the importance of it, nor can you really give any real flavour to the coverage, except I'll go through it and do my best. Sunday Times. Israel poised for Gaza invasion, evacuation chaos. Sunday Telegraph. Israel set to hit Hamas from land, sea and air. And also on the front page of the Telegraph, an important story, the BBC is embroiled in a row over allegations that BBC Arabic reporters appear to justify killing of civilians by Hamas terrorists. So we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But you've also got the Mail on Sunday concentrating on the big pro-Palestinian march in London. And their heading, which is "You Ghouls," refers to pictures on the backs of two women protesters, and these are pictures of paragliders. Yeah. And they say the protesters brazenly revel in the massacre of dozens of young Israelis by paragliding Hamas terrorists. Okay. It also adds, why didn't the police stop them? Just quickly on this, Sunday Express talks about the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn being on that march. They also talk about Rishi Sunak's position, PM, we stand by Israel always. But there's plenty of talk in the papers about the dangers ahead. And the Mirror particularly talks about the way that civilians in Gaza are escaping, how difficult it is for them. They call it the escape to hell. So you can cover some of those.
Well, let's try and break that down. A great overview there, John. I mean, the Sunday Times, let's start with Israel poised for Gaza invasion. That's what is happening today and in the next few days.
That's it. And there's some doubt about when. Obviously, nobody knows that. And nobody knows whether or not they're going to, how many people actually could leave Gaza, and the position of Egypt and other countries. So it's a complex situation simply because we don't know the timing, but also there is plenty of warning by people saying, including the US General Petraeus, who's is quoted in the Sunday Times, says that this could be a very difficult situation because if the Israelis don't have an exit plan from Gaza, so they go in, firing, what about the exit plan? And this is the war of no choice, as he puts it. So for lots of people saying, but is this a trap for Israel in the long term?
Well, one detail in the Sunday Times struck me. It says here how Anthony Blinken, the US's chief diplomat, has been using talks with his Chinese counterpart to try and urge Beijing to use influence over Iran to prevent conflict. I mean, it shows how so much has changed in just a week. Because the fact you've got this, the China is almost brokering some kind of talks with Iran.
That's right. And so the idea that this is a simple matter, that we can just consider the awfulness of it, which everybody feels, about everybody, and the civilians particularly, horrendous stories. So let's assume that we all accept that. But that you can go on from there, OK, what do you do, and what do you do in Gaza? And that's extremely complicated, and people are very, very worried about the effect of that.
Just moving on now and to the humanitarian consequences in Gaza, which the Sunday Mirror talk about there. Escape to hell. I mean, you've got this warning from this morning from on Twitter from the Israeli Defence Force asking people to move between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Here's the window to move south, but it is getting very, very tense there.
That's right. So the problem, I mean, what makes it so difficult on the Israeli side is that if they don't act quickly, then there's a whole question of you're raising the whole thing, and it's their sort of predominant. It gives the impression it's a premeditated war on Gaza. And to then say, look, we're reacting because of the terrorist action makes it harder as each day goes past. So they want to hurry, but can they hurry? And if they do hurry, what will the effect be if they get bogged down? So that's why the talk of the trap is so relevant.
Yeah, there's been talk already, I think, from the former head of MI6, Alex Younger, saying, this is what Hamas want Israel to do, to try and risk getting bogged down in what would be a really, really difficult war.
That's right.
And quite what happens next. Well, if you turning to the UK here, the Mail Sunday focusing on the marching in London yesterday, You Ghouls, on page one there. As you say there's pictures of the Hamas terrorists on their paraglides on the back of two of the marchers there. How did you feel seeing that in the streets of London? I mean, it was obviously they're marching in the pro-Palestine march, not a pro-Hamas march, and that's the important difference to make.
Yes, I mean, this is the whole difficulty about treating the whole issue as sort of on the one hand this, on the one hand that, because you think, well, is there going to be a pro-Israeli demonstration? And what form would that take, and when would it take? So, of course, isn't that? You've got to deal with the fact that lots of people in London who are Palestinian want to show they're Palestinian. Lots of Jews in London want to show they're Jewish. But the worry on the Jewish side is that if there are pro-Israeli demonstrations, you're whipping up anti-Semitism. So you've got a completely different factor in play here. And that for lots of people, lots of Jewish friends of mine, they're so upset by all these elements, and they're not similar. There's not a question of simply saying, oh, the Palestinians, the Israelis, let's deal with one, then talk about the other. It's not like that.
And there's reports on the front page of the Sunday Times there about the student hiding a Star of David.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a dreadful thing in this 21st century.
And you see that, obviously, the people like me, my whole sort of childhood onwards is affected by talk of the Holocaust.
Because you have experience of moving to Gaza when you're very young.
And I do. I have this extraordinary... I mean, it just happens that way. My father was a Christian missionary at the time when the War of Independence was taking place in Israel. So as a very young child with my brother and sister, we were evacuated, where to? Gaza, and we went from Gaza to Egypt, and we didn't know whether we were going to the Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere. We came by boat to Britain.
Exactly, and you've experienced reporting out there, I think, yourself.
I've been a reporter out there. I've been a reporter in northern Israel when Israel invaded Lebanon for the first time. I was there with John Major in Gaza, would you believe it, with Yasser Arafat in a joint news conference, and Yasser Arafat came and put his arm around me. And I was working with a young producer, Jewish producer, this was with ITV, and so I think the sort of idea of, I know a little bit about the tensions and difficulties of reporting.
How do you feel now about it, though, you've experienced the previous conflicts? How do you feel now, seeing, where do you rate, I suppose, this is as serious as it's been for 50 years nearly.
It's serious because there's no obvious precedent. Now we do this, now we do that. Now, in the past, there's always a feeling that, oh, well, the Israelis have got these, they've got tanks, they've got these sorts of weapons. But this is particularly difficult. And once you get hostages involved, and once you've dealt with hostages in the past, as in Israel, everyone has a memory of isn't it awful, the hostages, what's going to happen if you allow them to be killed? Now, the other thing, of course, if it's a terrorist, if it's a hostage-taking action involving the police, they always say, keep calm, keep in touch with people who are holding them, let time develop, and keep on sending them food and all sorts of things. And those hostage situations are amazingly sort of small in number, but this is on a entirely different scale.
There's some reports, of course, yesterday of some hostages dying already. They claim, Hamas claim, I think, under shelling.
It's very difficult to imagine they won't die. Lots of them will be killed. If not all of them may be killed.
Yes. You mentioned your time there as a BBC reporter. I'm fascinated about this debate in the past week about how to describe Hamas. Now, John Simpson, your former colleague, the World Affairs editor, wrote an article, didn't he, on the BBC website, saying we've never called any groups terrorists. Even the IRA were not called terrorists by the BBC.
That's right. I mean, we were struck with... I reported on Northern Ireland over a period of about 7 years in the 70s and the Troubles, and we knew the rules. We knew perfectly well we weren't going to come down on one side or the other, and that we had to report all these things. So, for me, I suppose, it's so part of my natural instinct after 30 years as a correspondent for the BBC, not to imagine that in a situation like this, oh, well, who's right and who's wrong? No, you report it as a dreadful story. But the BBC is not a government.
No.
The BBC is not even like a newspaper with editorials. And what if the headline was, BBC decides, after all, to support Israel?
It wouldn't say that, would it? It wouldn't say support
Israel. But if you imagine that was the sort of the mood of the headline, you think, gosh, what's happening there? So if people can understand what the BBC is trying to do, maybe they'll be more sympathetic. It's an extremely difficult operation for the BBC, involving considerable danger and people making these decisions at terrific speed.
But why can't you say they are terrorists? Because what happened last week to any ordinary person was terrorism.
Sure. No, if you're asking my personal opinion, I left the BBC some time ago. So what do you think about this? Terrorism. Yeah, that's quite simple.
So why not call them terrorism?
But I'm not. I'm speaking as an individual or speaking as a government. You're not talking about an international news organisation that is it's at the start of an extremely complicated international story.
Yes.
And the idea that and the word terrorism terrorism now does signify you're against people. Now, of course, the BBC is giving lots of quotes to that. The BBC is not stopping people calling them terrorists, but the BBC does not have an editorial line. That's it.
Simon Heffer on page 20 in the Sunday Telegraph talks about the moral cowardice.
Yeah.
I mean, is that fair?
Is your moral cowardice, weasel words? I tell you, it's more difficult being a BBC reporter at times like this. Than people imagine.
And the reports are also in the same newspaper about BBC Arabic reporters, apparently it says here, celebrating the attack that left 1,300 dead in Israel.
Well, I mean, the point is, the moment...
This is social media, not on the airwaves.
The problem with all these things is everyone's emotions are involved. If you are a dedicated, really sort of wound up on one side or the other, quite understandably, don't get me wrong, if my mother and father and sister and cousin had been killed, I would be kind of involved. There's a very good quote from a woman saying, "I'm sorry, at a time like this, I can only think of my own people." And I think that pretty well sums it up. If I was in that position, of course, all I could think of, my own relatives, my own people. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the BBC. I'm talking about a famous international news organisation that 500 million people watch and hear and listen to in all sorts of ways around the world. That is a very different operation. Well,
John Sargent, I'm afraid we've spoken just on one area today, but what else can you do? It's so serious in Gaza and Israel. We have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us today on the show.